Hello and welcome to our channel. Today's story is about a death that was anticipated but yet very shocking and will send shivers down your spine. In 2001, a devoutly religious woman named Faylene Grant seemed to predict her own death. Her journals, filled with disturbing visions and spiritual premonitions, spoke of a tragic end. Her husband, Doug Grant, claimed she had prophesied her demise, believing it was God's will. This chilling story began just months earlier, during their honeymoon, when Faylene mysteriously fell from a cliff. Miraculously, she survived with only minor injuries. But just a short time later, her life came to a shocking end. Doug told authorities he found her lifeless in their bathtub, suggesting she had accidentally drowned. On the surface, it seemed like a tragic accident, but as investigators dug deeper, a far more sinister picture began to emerge. They uncovered a complex web of religious manipulation, alleged affairs, and conflicting stories. The prosecution painted Doug Grant not as a grieving husband, but as a cunning manipulator who had preyed on his wife's deep faith. Their theory was shocking. Doug had convinced Faylene that her death was a divine sacrifice, a preordained event that she must accept. But why would he do such a thing? The motive, they argued, was to free himself to reunite with a former mistress. The case against Doug Grant seemed to hinge on a few key pieces of evidence. One of the most damning was a supposed confession. A star witness, a man who had been in jail with Doug, came forward claiming that Doug had admitted everything to him. He alleged that Doug detailed how he had held Faylene underwater, staging the scene to look like an accident. This testimony was explosive, seemingly confirming the prosecution's darkest suspicions. With this confession, the narrative of a cold, calculating husband appeared complete. However, the trial was anything but straightforward. The defense argued that the entire case was built on a foundation of lies and misinterpretations. They pointed to Faylene's history of health issues, including fainting spells, which could have led to an accidental drowning. They also questioned the credibility of the jailhouse informant, painting him as an opportunist looking for a lighter sentence in exchange for his testimony. The defense's biggest challenge, however, was trying to explain the series of bizarre events in Faylene's own writings, which seemed to corroborate the idea that she expected to die. One of the most controversial aspects of the trial was the judge's decision to exclude Faylene's journals from evidence. The prosecution wanted to use them to show how Doug had allegedly brainwashed her, but the defense argued they were simply the private, spiritual writings of a deeply religious woman, and their meaning was being twisted. The judge sided with the defense on this point, ruling that the journals were too prejudicial and could confuse the jury. This decision removed a central pillar of the prosecution's case, forcing them to rely more heavily on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of the jailhouse informant. The exclusion of her own words left a void in the courtroom, making it impossible for the jury to hear directly from Faylene about her state of mind in the days leading up to her death. In a stunning turn of events, years after the trial, the star witness recanted his testimony. He admitted that he had completely fabricated Doug Grant's confession. He claimed that prosecutors had pressured him, feeding him details of the case and promising him leniency in his own legal troubles if he delivered the testimony they needed. This admission threw the entire conviction into question. If the confession was a lie, what else about the prosecution's case was untrue? Allegations of prosecutorial misconduct began to swirl, with critics claiming that the state had been so determined to secure a conviction that they had resorted to unethical and illegal tactics. This revelation, however, came too late to change the original verdict. Doug Grant was ultimately convicted not of murder but of manslaughter. The jury, perhaps swayed by the lingering doubts and lack of hard physical evidence, couldn't agree on premeditated murder but believed he was responsible for her death in some way. He was sentenced to prison and served 5 years before being released. For many, the conviction was a form of justice for Faylene, but for others, it was a miscarriage of justice. A verdict secured through a fabricated confession and questionable legal strategies. The story doesn't end there. After his release from prison, Doug Grant, now a free man but with his reputation in tatters, decided to fight back. In an extraordinary move, he filed a wrongful death civil suit against the estate of his late wife, effectively suing himself as the representative of her estate. His goal was to clear his name in a court of law. Representing himself, Doug argued that there was never any credible evidence to prove he had harmed Faylene. He presented his own theory of the events, highlighting the lost forensic evidence and the recanted testimony that had convicted him in the civil trial. Doug was able to introduce the evidence that had been excluded from his criminal trial, including Faylene's journals. He argued that her writings showed a woman grappling with her faith in mortality, not a victim of brainwashing. He methodically picked apart the original prosecution's case, exposing its weaknesses and the misconduct that had plagued it. In a shocking verdict, the civil jury sided with Doug Grant. They found that there was not enough evidence to prove he was responsible for Faylene's death. He won the wrongful death suit, a legal victory that, in his eyes, exonerated him. So, where does that leave us? We have a criminal conviction for manslaughter and a civil verdict that essentially says he did undo it. We have a supposed confession that was later admitted to be a lie. We have lost evidence and a victim's own words that were kept out of her husband's trial. Was Doug Grant a masterful manipulator who nearly got away with murder? Or was he the victim of a flawed investigation and a justice system desperate for a conviction? The death of Faylene Grant remains a deeply unsettling mystery. Her own premonitions of death add a layer of tragic irony to the case, leaving us to wonder if she truly foresaw her own end, and if the real truth of what happened in that bathtub will ever be fully known. What do you think really happened? Let me know your theories down in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and if you found this case as fascinating as I did, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into mysterious cases. See you next time.